Hey, good morning, guys. What's going on? Today I want to talk about fear. I'll tell a story or describe some of the fear that I'm experiencing and try to relate it back to anything you might be going through. So my fear continues to be based on the trip that I'm planning for. And to make a long story short, although the trip is still a few months away, I've noticed that over the last few days, my fears about going on this trip have gone up in amplitude quite a bit, so they've gotten much stronger. I've started having dreams about the trip, and they're fear-based anxiety dreams. So in the dream, for example, a couple of nights ago, I'm being driven to the launching point or whatever, the departure location. And as I'm getting closer and closer to the destination in the dream, I'm feeling more and more and more fear about going on the trip. That's a good description of how I've noticed that the feeling of fear arises when I'm awake as well. Now, what's interesting about the fear, and this is the part that I really want to focus on, is that the fear is based on the loss or changing of my ego as it relates to social roles. It's nothing to do with what you might call a real fear or practical fear. For example, the fear isn't based on having enough money for the trip, because I have enough money for the trip. The fear isn't based on what might happen to me during the trip physically, because I've been preparing and will be prepared for the trip physically when it happens. All the fear is based on the fact that who I think I am, so my roles that I'm fulfilling, husband, father, employee, may change. Not like getting rid of them at all. I'm not saying that. But they are going to change. And that change of my ego identity is what is driving the fear. And it's really interesting because in the dream, for example, where I'm being driven closer and closer to the location, and the fear is increasing, that fear, even though in the dream I'm the person being driven, that fear isn't coming from me. It's coming from my ego structure, right? The image of who I identify with most of the time, the person who I think that I am, is a husband, father, employee, etc., etc. And all those things are real, but they're only relatively real, right? Like when I'm at work, I'm a certain person. I'm at home, I'm the same person, but I'm a slightly different flavor, you could say, of that person. Like, I don't act like employee Stephen at home. And at work, I don't act like home Stephen. And so both of those are real, but they're only relatively real. And so that ego structure is what's being threatened by this trip, because it's going to involve a whole new setting, a whole new group of people, and who I am today, or who I think I am today, is threatened by the trip, in that those parts of me may change or die off altogether. And so for my ego, that is a very scary proposition. And it's funny, funny, haha, funny, or whatever, to see how in my dreams and my waking life, my ego, so this part of my mind who I think I am, but I must not have any control over, is triggering these fears. That also helps me remember that that means that it's not me who's afraid. It's just a part of me. A part of, if I was to relate this to software, I would say that, do I identify with a program that's running like Internet Explorer, and Internet Explorer is my ego and it's generating all these web pages or dreams or scenarios in my mind of disaster or things going wrong or building anxiety? Or am I the Windows operating system that Internet Explorer is operating on? So which of those two do I identify with? Or am I the hardware that the computer is physically? Right? Well, it's definitely not that. Although a lot of people, again, I've talked about this before, but you're not the physical body, and you're not your psychosocial rules. So you're not your physical computer, the motherboard and the keyboard, the monitor, but you're also not the software that's running. You're something else. Anyway, so it's been very interesting for me, and so I wanted to relate that to you as you think about, if I asked you, what's one thing you want to do in 2017? Like, if the one thing you've wanted to do for a really long time, if this was the year that we finally made that happen, what would that be? And for some of you, it would be going on a trip like the one I'm planning. For some of you, it would be going back to school. For some of you, it would be volunteering with an organization that you admire, or that you feel like you would be, enjoy serving. For some of you, it might be leaving an abusive relationship. But if I ask, what's the one thing that, if we could do it in 2017, the one thing that you could do? Now let's say you named it, and you said, going back to school. Let's pick an easier one emotionally. So you say, I want to go back to school. Because you're at a place in your career where you have some schooling, maybe you don't have any schooling, and you realize that to get the job that you really want, maybe it's in the same career field or you're going to change careers, but to go do the thing that you really want to do, you have to get more education. But maybe you have kids, or maybe you don't have any money, or maybe you already have like 2 or 3 jobs, part-time jobs, and there's no time. But then let's say you solve for that. So you either find the money, or you find the time, or you find a babysitter for the kids or something. So whatever the major practical problem is, let's say you were able to address that. Something happened recently, so now 2017 is here, you're ready to go back to school. You've solved the practical problem. As you start to lean forward into that dream, as you start to lean forward into pursuing that goal, what fears start to rise up inside of you? Like the ones I was talking about with me, the changing roles of husband, father, and employee. And if you have to, just pause the video and take a second and visualize yourself. And in this case, I'm using going back to school. So visualize yourself in school. Does any fear pop up? And it might not. At first, you might just be like, wow, this is really awesome. I'm really excited about going back to school. So this might take a few days of visualization and meditation. So I guess that's your homework, is to figure out the one thing that you want to do and visualize a scenario where you have overcome the practical obstacles and you're doing the thing. So you're going back to school in this case. And just keep replaying that scenario in your head all day, as often as you can, and for the next few days. And watch to see what fears rise up. Because again, we're visualizing the money and the time and whatever. The practical stuff's taken care of. So then what else is there to worry about? And I'll bet you'll see, just like I have, that it's your ego that is identified with a certain set of roles and responsibilities that's threatened by your change is going to rise up and create fear. But it's creating the fear, which means it's not real. It's trying to scare you away because it's afraid of changing and dying, because egos are very static and they have a lot invested in the status quo. That's why it's hard to change. The problem is that most of us too often identify with the ego. We think we are that status, or that static personality that is resistant to change. We think that's who we are. But that's not who we are. That's just a tool that helps us interact with others in the world, and it's not a creative center of your mind. The ego is not creative. The The ego is good at interacting in a certain situation with certain other kinds of people from a certain perspective, i.e. in a certain role or responsibility. And when the situation changes, when the other people change, or when you change, it's like a three-legged stool, and you start changing the legs on the stool. The ego itself is threatened because it doesn't know what's going to happen next, because it's not a creative center of your brain. So it starts to feel threatened because it doesn't know how it's going to survive with you messing things up, or with other people messing things up if they start to change or if they leave you. And that's where the fear is coming from. But the fear is not yours. It's being handed to you, but you don't have to accept it. So, that was your homework. Good luck with that. Don't let the fear overwhelm you. If it starts to get too scary or you start to get too nervous, just drop the exercise. Alright, no nervous breakdowns. That's a rule. Anyway, Happy New Year. Have a great day. Talk to you later.